Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center, and glad to have you here with us tonight. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint, and we have some new folks in tonight, so I'm glad to see the new folks. And as I said, this is the stay-at-home lecture for tonight, and it is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, which is the support organization for the Historical Research Center. And the Historical Research Center is the archives division of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, UAMS. We're located in the UAMS library. And our mission is to not only collect and preserve the institutional records of UAMS, but also the history of medicine and the health professions throughout Arkansas. So we have collections that when you look at on the surface, they don't have anything to do with UAMS, but if they have something to do with medicine or the associated health professions like dentistry or veterinary science or something like that, then we also collect materials on that. We have a large collection documenting that history and UAMS, of course. Most of our, I'd love for y'all to come down and see the collection sometime. We're located in the Education 2 building on the UAMS campus, and then we're on the 5th floor of the building, part of the library. Going back to the society, as I mentioned, the society is the support organization for the history or the Historical Research Center. And they support us in a number of ways, not only through programming such as this, and then our annual dinner and lecture, which is coming up this fall, but also in financial ways as well. They help us purchase books and materials for our collection, and also for receptions and things like that for our programming. So we're really pleased and appreciate all the things that the society does for us in the preservation, to help in the preservation of the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. We'd love for you to join the society. If you're not a member, to join, you can use that link you see on your screen, or you can bypass that long URL and just go to paypal.me/shmhp, and you can choose your membership level from there. And the membership dues are really reasonable: $15 for an individual, $5 for a student. And you don't have to be a student at UAMS. You can be a student anywhere in the United States or in the world. We don't just limit it to UAMS students. So I hope you'll consider joining. And please, if you're down in Little Rock and you'd like to see our collection, give me a call or email us at the email address on the screen, and I'd love to give you a tour. Now, as I mentioned, this is the lecture series. We have been doing this since March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, and we have it's the first Thursday of every month from 7 to 8. And next month, I will be speaking on Dr. G. Thomas Jansen, who was a well-known dermatologist in Arkansas and in the nation. He was on the faculty at UAMS for a number of years. So I hope you'll join me next month on July 6th to hear more about Dr. Jansen's life and career. Now, tonight, I am glad to welcome Joshua Youngblood to the series tonight, to the lecture. And Joshua is currently the Instruction and Outreach Unit Head in the Special Collections Division at the University of Arkansas Libraries at U of A in Fayetteville. And he also serves as the History and Rare Books Librarian and curator of the Arkansas collection. He joined Special Collections in 2011. Before he joined Special Collections, he was a member of the Florida Memory Project of the State Archives of Florida and served as the information officer of the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and was a staff member of the Florida Main Street in the Bureau of Historic Preservation. So my former coworker, friend of mine, and I'm glad to have Joshua here. He's going to be talking about Dr. Frederick Liebolt, a nationally known orthopedic surgeon. So Joshua, if you'll turn on your camera, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There you are.
All right, there I am.
And I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to turn off my camera and my video. And just before I go, we'll have questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to type it into the chat box. You don't have to wait until the end to do that. You can do that while Joshua is talking, but we will wait and answer them at the end of the presentation. So Joshua, up to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And also thank you to the UAMS History Research Center. I haven't had the pleasure of getting down there myself yet, but I really look forward to doing that as soon as I can. So again, my name is Joshua Youngblood. Thank you for that very generous introduction, Tim. And I am, as Tim mentioned, a rare books librarian here. I'm the head of our instruction and outreach. So I'm not a physician. I am not an expert on the history of medicine by any stretch of the imagination, but I am very interested in this individual. I get the great pleasure and honor to talk about tonight, Dr. Frederick Liebolt. I know there are some folks on the call who are joining us tonight who might know a little bit more about both the history of medicine in Arkansas and around the nation, and also maybe even a bit more about Arkansas families, Fayetteville families, and some of the issues I'm going to mention. So I do encourage you, please do ask questions, put some questions in the chat, and I really look forward to hearing from you. That said, I have a lot of slides to get through. I'm going to do my best to tell you all about Arkansas's famed surgeon, Frederick Liebolt, and my talk, which I've entitled the Leading Edge and the Legacy of Learning, because when looking at this individual, some things to keep in mind is both his dedication to his profession and innovating in that profession, and the amazing work he did over decades and decades of really being at the top of his field, but also his commitment to education and ensuring opportunities for other people to go into medicine, but also the other sciences, which I'll get to a little bit later in the talk. So a lot of what I'm going to be mentioning is pulled directly from the Frederick Liebolt papers at Special Collections. So one of the things that I do here at in Fayetteville is that I help people do research and I promote access and use of our archives. I am an archivist as well. I'm a certified archivist, and I get to work with students and researchers and people all over the country and all over the world to gain access to our materials. And the Liebolt papers are a particularly fascinating collection. And so I have images and some documents and photographs and all sorts of stuff that we'll look through. The Liebolt papers, as you can see here on the slide, comprised of 211 boxes and more than 164 linear feet. So it's a very large collection. It has a lot of his research files, really exhaustive representation of his research over decades. There's also personal and professional correspondence. There's scrapbooks. I'll talk a lot about his scrapbooks a little bit later, but his amazing scrapbooks he kept, particularly early in his life. It has all sorts of media in there. So there's audio and visual materials, there's cassette tapes, there's Edaphone wax cylinders, dictaphone sheets, all sorts of media you might not have even heard of. So if you wanted to just see examples of antiquated or archaic media, it's good for that, as well as being so illuminating about the career, the really extraordinary career of an orthopedic surgeon, Frederick Liebolt.
Hey, Joshua,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Your presentation is on where we see the slides.
Thank you so much for telling me. Yep, I will stop share and we'll go. That should work now, right?
Yes.
Yes, thank
Good.
you. My screen's switched on me. So now you could be able to see all my details from the Liebolt papers a little bit more clearly. This is an example from the front of the finding aid for this collection. It is open to the public. We've had it since 1997. It does get research in use. But it's important to point out that there are restrictions on a lot of what's in here because Liebolt was exhaustive in his collecting. He was very meticulous in his collecting, and it includes a lot of patient records, both from military personnel and also people that were his that he worked with through academic appointments and his patients from his private practice. And so there are records that won't be available to researchers for 75 years, but I've tried to find some ways to share some highlights from those research files, even with those restrictions being in place. So he was a remarkable student, a remarkable young professional, but he came from a remarkable place, which is Fayetteville in the early 20th century. And he had some remarkable peers. I want to talk a little bit about his career at the University of Arkansas, just very briefly, and really highlight the social grouping that he emerged out of. What you see on the screen here is a scan from the Razorback yearbook from 1925. You see young Frederick Liebolt there, and I'll talk about how young he was in just a moment. You can see him ready for graduation. Right next to him is Peggy Sue Lighton, who would go on to become a lawyer. This class was just absolutely full of remarkable people, many of whom Freddie Liebolt actually grew up with. But even among this amazing group of people, he stands out, and he stands out because of the longevity and the contributions and the impact of his career, but also just all the people that he worked with over the years. Frederick Liebolt treated more than 10,000 patients over more than 40 years, while also researching, while being members of organizations, while just being an extremely engaged and just amazingly energetic individual. And you can see on the right there, that's him standing on the Old Main Lawn in Fayetteville, very proudly holding his diploma when he graduated. Liebolt was born in 1905 in Macquon, Illinois. He moved to Fayetteville with his family at age 5, so they were relative newcomers, like one of his friends who grew up with, Bill Fulbright. Also, the Fulbrights were newcomers, but they lived right near campus. He was the son of Joseph Lee and Catherine Swigert Liebolt. Their home was at the corner of Ida and Arkansas, which, if you know the U of A campus, is actually just right off the eastern edge of campus. Rosa Marinoni, who is poet laureate of the state of Arkansas and was an Italian immigrant, Italian American who lived here. She proudly remembered later in life when people would ask her about Freddie Liebolt and him being from Fayetteville. She remembered him as a little boy that would play in the lawn right across the street from her villa, which her villa wasn't actually built at the time, it was just her house. But then she built a villa in 1924 and remembers the Lieboldts being right across the street. Liebolt attended University High, like a lot of his other peers, before entering the University of Arkansas. You can see here a page from one of his family's scrapbooks, and he kept, as I mentioned, very good and complete records. And we have lots of photographs from his family's time in the Midwest, in Illinois, their life as farmers, and then so evidence of that led them to move to Arkansas in the early 20th century. So it was an amazing time to be in Fayetteville, all except for that war that happened, and then, of course, the Depression that happened later. But in the first couple of decades in Fayetteville, there were some really amazing families and some really remarkable people that came out of there. So as I mentioned, Freddie and Bill Fulbright were classmates and playmates as kids. Their family was active in civic affairs, which is really bustling and vibrant in Fayetteville at the time. You see a picture down here from one of the family scrapbooks showing members, some of the women from the Liebolt family at the Meadow Valley Country Club. They were very, very engaged in social activities. Up above is a picture of their house at the corner of Ida and Arkansas. I think, and someone could correct me later, I think that there is a piece of this structure that's still there that's been converted to international exchange student housing. So he grew up with Fulbright. He also grew up with Charles Murrow Wilson, who would go on to publish more than 40 books and was a celebrated writer. He grew up with Peggy Lighton, who I mentioned earlier. When he and Fulbright were in college, they graduated just a year after C.G. Cripp Hall, who would go on to become the Secretary of State for the state of Arkansas. Liebolt was in the same graduating class along with his buddy Fulbright, who was all of 20 when he graduated. But I want to take a moment to just pause that you had these remarkable people who had a lot of opportunity, and a lot of these people that were at the U of A and came from Fayetteville in the early 20s were coming in the wake of the Great War, World War I, and the impact of the Spanish influenza and the war on not just Fayetteville, but the entire country. And so in some ways you have Fulbright, you have Charles Murrow Wilson, you have you have Freddie Lee Liebolt taking opportunities that they had and really running with it. And I think that the war and that particular time of change really impacted what the drive that he showed throughout his life and career. The bottom of the page here, you'll see a quote from Liebolt about remembering what it was like growing up with Fulbright. He said, "We were about 8 and Bill got me to skip and go to a ball game. We were caught and had to stay in every day for a week." Freddie was a very diligent student, and he remembers Bill being kind of the troublemaker. So I mentioned the Fulbright graduated at 20. Liebolt did him one better. He graduated at 19, which at the time made him the youngest U of A graduate of all time. A quote I found in the Fayetteville Democrat newspaper described him as the ubiquitous Liebolt. He was active in so many things, including university high athletics and lots of different clubs. I put prodigy here as a question mark. When I've encountered histories of Liebolt and talked to other people, he's described sometimes as a prodigy because he graduated at such a young age. And then, as I'll talk about, he had such great success in his career very quickly. But I think that if we were to ask him, he would say it was diligence and hard work. And for his medical career, it was particularly inspired work, which I'll talk a little bit more. See another page here from his scrapbook, including his name as it originally appeared on Senior Walk, Frederick Liebolt, right next to Peggy Sue Lighton, and some of his classmates proudly getting ready to leave their beloved alma mater. I mentioned before that Liebolt is a very meticulous guy. His records, his scrapbooks, the archives are a lot of fun to go through, particularly if you want to see what a really beautifully put together and constructed scrapbook can look like. You see an example here on the page about the Razorbacks' success while he was in the 1924 season and 25 season. And I just wanted to show this page because you can see how careful he was with the knife, which is important, of course, later, but also how much he thought about how he conveyed information, how you could use the page, and the care that he put into even the most mundane of tasks. And on the left here, you see a list of his social functions. And so he actually wrote down and recorded every single social event that he took part in, at least for this particular year. So that shows someone with a great attention to detail, diligence, as I mentioned, and somebody who really cares about the campus community that he was a part of and the people that he was spending his time with, his classmates and his peers. He was a very careful communicator as well. This is another page from his scrapbooks that's just exemplative of how carefully he read and studied and also maintained contact and thought about the people that were writing him. So he actually took through and went through his correspondence collected while he was a university student and selected the phrases he wanted to remember from. Some, I think, were girlfriends, some were just close pals, some were people that he was involved in activities with. And there's pages and pages in his scrapbooks showing how much these words meant to him. And then, of course, he cut them out and arranged them and glued them. Just a side note, as an archivist here, the gluing in his scrapbooks is really amazing. It's withstood the test of decades, and scrapbooks usually don't. So I give him a lot of credit for that. They're really nice scrapbooks. But he was a prolific and thoughtful correspondent as well. It wasn't just about how pretty the scrapbooks were. He really took the time to maintain connections, to stay in contact and relationship with it. His archives show this incredible evidence of correspondence collected, voluminous correspondence collected and organized over decades and decades, to somewhat a degree that's surprising. There's a couple of years that I looked at where he actually saved the drafts of and carbon copies of his thank you notes for gifts and cards he'd received in the mail for Christmas. So maybe a little bit more thorough than some of us would be, but it's great for a researcher to go look at. And also you can track how important the relationships were to him over the course of his life through how carefully he collected that correspondence. When you talk about Frederick Lee Liebolt, you have to look at just what a remarkable student he really was. So I mentioned that he graduated from the UA Fayetteville in 1925. At the time, he was too young to enter medical school, so he went up to the University of Kansas. He pursued graduate school at 2 different places, the University of Kansas and the Kansas State Teachers College, for a year. He then went on and became the youngest recipient, again, setting a youngest record, the youngest recipient of a Doctor of Medicine from Washington University in St. Louis. And he was, that was the first medical degree he would receive. He received that in 1930. So in 4 years, he got his MD. And I mentioned the correspondence and the people that he liked to stay in touch with. It's worth noting, and this I think left a lasting impression on him in his life. There was a network of supporters, including doctors that had treated him, that remained his sponsors and supporters, and he stays in touch with people for decades and decades afterwards. I have a couple more examples from his scrapbooks to show you. These are from actually, well, we have one Razorback scrapbook, but then some from the Kansas University. He was only there a year, but he sure did do some collecting while he was there. He has a pin there about the Kansas fights with a little clipping, the sort of college I'd send my boy to. But almost more interesting is his handmade or hand-printed booklet from the Snow Zoology Club, which he joined while he was there. Then also we see down at the bottom some examples from him having joined Phi Beta Pi, the medical fraternity, of which he would be a lifelong member and a devoted member of, and devote a lot of his service, personal and professional service to over his career. So mentorship and the support of the people he met along the way was important to him personally, but is also crucial to the success he had in his career. His archive shows, for instance, his sincere gratitude to a Dr. Frank Dixon from Kansas City. And I just pulled this one doctor because this correspondence shows up over many years. But that doctor was a benefactor, meaning he actually helped raise funds to pay for medical school for Freddie Liebolt. Freddie wrote him. They stayed in contact, and Freddie would send him letters. At the top, you see some examples there saying, "Oh, I had this great lecture. You would have loved it," or "I did this," or these courses have been really exciting," or "I learned this new technique today," and he would keep him apprised of it. But then Dixon actually served instrumental in securing for the now Dr. Liebolt after 1930. Some really important appointments and further internships, including one that would change his life and change his career and really set him on a rapidly accelerating upward arc in his career, his internship with the New York Orthopedic Dispensary and Hospital. And you can see Dr. Dixon, writing to Freddie to giving him an update and how the other doctors are asking about him and thanking him for staying in touch, and also saying that, and we're also working on getting you appointed in different places. Throughout his life, Freddie Liebolt really remained proud of Arkansas. I took that quote there from his pen, which he saved in his scrapbook. And later, the connection, the strong emotional connection that he felt towards his alma mater, which is how he always referred to the U of A, would be apparent in how he created a legacy as not just a doctor, but also or a physician or a surgeon, but also as a proud alum. He stayed in touch with his professors. So it wasn't just the people helping him along the way. He would also write frequently to his professors. During World War II, and I'll talk more about his service in a bit, but his correspondence shows him checking on how the state was doing, how the guys on campus were doing, checking with administrators to see if there's anything he could do. And then also telling them, I'm going into the service as well. He also tracked politics, social and organizational happenings, and stayed very connected to his family and his network of friends in Arkansas and in Kansas City and in St. Louis and other places. So those connections back home were always with him, even as his career raced forward. And his career really did pick up a lot of momentum. This little piece of correspondence I provided here is actually from the head of the chemistry department at the U of A. And he wrote now Dr. Frederick Liebolt in New York to congratulate him on his internship, which he had heard about, and how that internship was turning into a fellowship. So people back home were tracking him even before he became famous. And I'll talk about that, his growing fame in just a little bit. But he interned at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City and as a surgical intern at Barnes before he got that appointment at the New York Orthopedic Hospital. He held that internship from 1930 to 1932. It was a very competitive internship. He wasn't sure he was going to get it, but he and his advisors and supporters knew that it would change his career. After 2 years of that, he was one of the only young physicians in America or young surgeons in America to get a fellowship at the Orthopedic Hospital. So that is a paid position following, and he held that fellowship for 4 years. And as I mentioned, folks back home were watching this career and kept telling him how proud they were, even as they saw his star start to rise at a national level. His academic career began when he was there in New York. By 1934, he was an instructor of anatomy at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. He was continuing his training at Columbia and had that residency in orthopedic surgery as well. Along the way, he married Eugenia Davis of Kansas City, his first wife. I'll talk a little bit more about Eugenia in a few minutes. But then at Columbia, he completed his second medical degree and became Doctor of Medical Science in 1937. Here's another clipping talking about the fellowship and his internship and now his residency. And this was a clipping from the Fayetteville newspaper about Dr. Frederick Liebolt, now of New York, being honored with these appointments. And just as he was so successful in his education, he also became immediately successful as a teacher. He held dual faculty posts very quickly at Columbia and at Cornell. He began teaching at the School of Physical Therapy at the New York Hospital, which is closely aligned with Cornell, in 1938. He would resign his teaching at Columbia College Physicians and Surgeons in 1947, but he remained the head of the Department of Orthopedics. And he was also associate professor of clinical surgery at Cornell University. Along the way, he also became a professor of physical therapy and a professor of anatomy at Ithaca College, which, Cornell is in Ithaca, but he was at Ithaca College. His professorship there is actually, I am not sure, I couldn't quite confirm this, but I think he might have been the first professor appointed to the physical therapy school at Ithaca, because that was only founded in 1948. And then he held that position until 1953. We see some images here of him at work and him advising some students, both on anatomy and physiology, but also on demonstrating surgical technique. So I want to touch back a little bit on the origin of bone surgery and orthopedic surgery as his specialization. And so what Frederick Liebolt really became famous for was as an orthopedic surgeon, and then the innovations that became nationally and internationally known. And I looked through newspaper articles and a few other sources trying to see where this interest came from. And I did find, in fact, that there was a profound inspiration for his work. And that was that when he was in University High, he had a severe back injury. And that back injury, it ended his football career, among other things. But it also, he had to travel to go get help. And it was actually in Kansas City, that is, that he met an orthopedic surgeon who was up there for a very long time. And the orthopedic surgeon helped him through physical therapy techniques and also through procedures to help correct the condition. And so he looked at that throughout his life and said, oh, this is something I really want to devote myself to. And he became inspired. So yes, he was a particularly gifted student. He is someone that had the mental capacity and the talent to have his success, but he was also inspired by the people in his life, and by his own personal experiences. So with that seriousness, I wanted to also show this caricature, which is from his archives. Dr. Liebolt performing surgery, and he saved this caricature with his personal and professional effects for all of us to enjoy these years and decades later. So after he's established his teaching career and his star is beginning to rise as he becomes a little bit more famous as a surgeon, he opened private offices in New York in 1938, which is the same time he began full-time as an instructor of orthopedic surgery at Columbia. He and his wife, Eugenia from Kansas City, became enmeshed in New York's social life pretty quickly. In fact, if you were to go through the New York Times databases or other databases of news stories looking for Frederick Liebolt, you might find, and I know this from personal experience, a lot more articles about their social activities and appearances than even his celebrated achievements as a physician. Over the years, he became named an Arkansas Traveler, officially by Governor Ben Laney, making him an official goodwill ambassador for the state. But he attended functions both in New York and around the nation representing Arkansas, even as he and Eugenia were very involved in different social organizations and were well known in social circles in New York. A couple of examples here, an article from the New York Times. Mrs. Liebolt, who is busy on January 25th event, headed a Tiara Fete, has job for 1958, about her chairmanship of a ball, the Blue Ridge Ball. Another image of Eugenia with her colleagues from the Metropolitan Guild, organizing social functions, and from her involvement with Kappa Kappa Gamma from 1940 and 1941, after they were really just early on settling into New York, and how she was helping put on some Kappa Gamma Gamma events there. Eugenia and Freddie had their only child together in 1941, and that was Frederick Lee Liebolt III, who would later go by Freddie Jr. You see some images here from the scrapbooks again, some really cute pictures of Freddie as a baby, the young Freddie, who would go by Lee as well, and Lee Jr. His first birthday, proudly leaving the hospital, a little bit older with his dad, the famous Dr. Freddie Liebolt, and then with his mom a few years after that on the streets of New York. So I want to take just a pause and kind of like talk about, this rapid acceleration in his career and his life. Frederick Liebolt, I think it's fair to say, was a very ambitious person, but his ambition came amidst profound changes. What you're looking at is an image actually we put on here from an exhibit we put on in special collections several years ago, and we saved some images from it. And you can see from a young man to his military service, you see this just this timeline that just goes forward. Later in life, he would reflect on his successes and some of the things, and we'll talk a little bit about his inventions and other things in just a few minutes. But he would also talk about how medical science, by the time he retires, is completely different. And his whole life, which spans almost the entirety of the 20th century, was marked by not only his own advances and in his career and life changes that just come one after another, and him being involved in all sorts of stuff, was also marked by World War I and World War II, rapid advances in medical science, other innovations, and then some disruptions in his own personal life that happened along the way. So he achieved all these things, and he had great ambitions, but it was amidst profound and really dramatic change. So biographies of Dr. Liebolt have pointed out that his career was paused. This is because that's how he described it for World War II. But I put a question mark there because it's hard to look at the things he achieved during World War II and think of it as a pause in his research. He did have to pause and go off on leave without pay from his teaching positions, his multiple teaching positions. And that was when he was drafted into the service in 1943, and he joined the Army Air Force. Now, he had been active in ROTC since a teenager, actually on his own time pursued recertifications in gun training and other things in his 20s and 30s. So he was ready to go into the service. So it really wasn't that much of a shock, the service aspect of it, but he did have to leave New York, and he went down to Coral Gables, where he became the chief of orthopedic service at the Army and Air Force Regional and Convalescent Hospital down there. So what you're looking at is one of his portraits. He was inducted actually as a major, and then he would leave the service a few years later as a lieutenant colonel. So he was even a rapid riser there. But and there's also an article here from the Coral Gables Hospital military newsletter. And this article is pointing out that he's just arrived, but he's already scheduled to give some lectures. He's already inspected our services here. He's approves of what we're doing. And he's really excited about all the work that we're going to be able to get done here in Coral Gables. So that said, he was lecturing and training medical personnel while he was there, even while he was the lead surgeon. And one of the subjects he lectured on, mentioned in this article, is orthopedic wounds and their management and physical training, among many other topics. Just a note on the Coral Gables as Army Air Force Hospital. If you know anything about the Biltmore Hotel, that's where it was. It was a luxury hotel built down in Coral Gables. It's still there. It's reopened as a hotel now, but over the years it became a sanitarium, and then was a hospital, private and military, but that's where he was working as a surgeon in the military, was in this luxury hospital that had been converted over to help injured enlisted men and officers, and particularly those with severe injuries and with disruptions to the mobility and use of their limbs. So this image right here is from archives related to the Biltmore Hotel's time as the Pratt General Hospital from Florida International University. That's not Dr. Liebolt there, but it is another physician carefully attending to some servicemen that were there. So he had a remarkable tenure, even in his free service in the American the Army Air Force. As I mentioned, he lectured. He also led new innovative techniques and created some techniques while I was there to aid in the recuperation of severe wounds, particularly hands. He developed some research specialization on repairing hands while he was there. As the Army surgeon, still with his lieutenant colonel appointment after he returns to New York in 1947, there's articles appearing in newspapers about all the research that's happening. And he was excited about a lot of the work that was happening during World War II. And he was excited that surgeons like himself, but others, were using the lessons that they learned during the war. And one of the ones that he had come up with was repairs to mutilated hands and limbs, and how this wartime innovation, which he was a part of, really moved forward some techniques that changed medical science in the way not just military personnel, but others like athletes could be treated. Here's an article from the New York Sun talking about how the war study that he was involved with greatly accelerated hand surgeries and treatments of mutilated hands. So I mentioned earlier, I wanted to share a couple of highlights from his research files because they're really remarkable. But I tried to obscure some of the personal information. You can see here his write-ups for his research that he maintained. There's just hundreds and hundreds of examples of his research, and then some images collected of hands that were having innovative techniques, like these cut gloves that help with maneuvering, and then hands that have mobility again after treatments they received in Coral Gables. And here's a really an image that really just popped out to me. If you can look closely at this, you'll see some buttons threaded onto that hand that's been treated by the surgeon. So there were some imaginative approaches employed as well. While he was there in Coral Gables, the hospital treated more than 701 patients on a monthly basis. I have daily there, that's a mistake. It was 701 patients monthly, and he performed more than 701 patients daily. And he performed 125 surgeries monthly, or he and his team of surgeons, which is really remarkable. He received an Army commendation for his service, and then he was released, as I mentioned earlier, as a lieutenant colonel. And what this is, if you can't see that writing, is this is extensor tendons by wire sutures, how he describes this. And so using buttons and wire to repair the tendons inside the hand and then sutured. So he was leading from the front as a celebrated surgeon. After restarting his academic and private practice, he quickly gained recognition for the hand treatments, but then he did the thing that really made him a national celebrity, at least for a little while. He was the first surgeon to have a televised operation. That surgery was broadcast to 1,200 members of the American College of Surgeons at one of its conventions in New York. The College of Surgeons was actually meeting at the Waldorf Astoria while they were doing the surgery, while he and six other colleagues, 7 surgeons, were performing it. And what he was demonstrating was a procedure that he had perfected on how to restore the use of the knee, and it was to restore use in a way that was previously not possible. And it was one of the first procedures or knee surgeries that would allow athletes who had similar injuries to return after severe knee injury. And he had developed this technique by actually working on pilots who sustained injuries similar to collegiate athletes like football players in the way that they would damage their knees. And so he innovated this, and then they televised it, the first televised surgery ever. You see a clipping here. Fayetteville native performs first operation to be televised ever, and that was in 1947. So here's some articles and some images that ran in the New York Times of that very much celebrated surgery. So it was repair of the cruciate ligament. This is where I'm going to say some medical terminology that I don't know a lot about, but as Liebolt would describe it, the cruciate ligament crosses the knee at the front and prevents the joint from slipping out of place when it's thrown forward. It's a common injury of the pilots, as I mentioned. And so the technique took pieces of muscle from the thigh through a drilled hole in the knee joint and then fastened them below the knee to allow mobility again. The televised surgery was an experiment from RCA and trying to demonstrate how teaching techniques could actually be shared around the world. So as he was described by Walter J. Liempke, he was not just a famous surgeon, but he was a real thing. He kept those connections back home, as I mentioned. Liempke and Rosemary and others would describe him as just a regular Fayetteville boy, or as a real Horatio Alger story. Meanwhile, every time he came back to the state, news stories would talk about our famed surgeon who's returned. Here's another article. He returns to see the Porkers play. The headline in the Gazette, but it does show Freddie Liebolt sitting there with Secretary of State C.J. Grip Hall and also Governor McMath. So he has achieved some fame and success for sure. And of course, he's that Arkansas ambassador still too. But when he would come home, people noticed. And then they also wanted him to do things like be a famous Arkansan and an ambassador at the Texas and Arkansas game. So I wish I got those governor tickets for that game, but it hasn't happened yet. But for Dr. Liebolt, that was happening. In the 1940s, after around the time of his famous surgery, he was also became an honored Razorback, and he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws in 1948. And as his honor said, that as a surgeon, he ministered skillfully and faithfully. As a research worker, he added valuable knowledge, and as an Army officer in the Medical Corps, he rendered outstanding service. And so he is worthy of admiration of all Americans and Arkansans. So he became a very influential expert outside of medical literature as well, even as he was publishing. This is some excerpts from a Life magazine article that's cited his work, talking about innovations and changes in the treatment of the body and orthopedics and physical therapy. And he, meanwhile, he was becoming an expert and a surgeon to famous people. He was sought out by folks he knew, and then folks just that had heard about his reputation, and his archives bears out how people sought out his work. I've talked about his innovations as a surgeon and physician, but he was also very active as a scholar and as an inventor. He has authored more than 30 research papers. He was participated in 8 different book publications, at least 8 book publications, because chapters were reprinted later. His own book, Illustrated Review of Fracture Treatment, was released in 1954. And he had multiple inventions, and his archives actually includes examples of his inventions. This is an image of some of his hand treatment pieces and some other straps and apparatus that he used to repair hands. One of his inventions is the first metallic prosthesis that could be inserted into an elbow joint. I've alluded to his energy in service and his willingness to give back in ways other than as a physician and a surgeon and as an educator. And that is certainly true. He was a member of a lot of groups and did a lot of work. And the fact that he had his 2 medical degrees and he had his academic appointments, he had his private practice, and then to think of all the stuff that he was doing outside of that is really remarkable. He was on the editorial staff of the Quarterly of the Phi Beta Pi Medical Fraternity Journal. As I mentioned earlier, he was very involved with that organization, but he was on the editorial staff for more than 16 years, and it actually started while still an intern, and he maintained it through his early career as it was accelerating. He was Secretary Treasurer of the New York Alumni Association, another organization he was a member of for many, many years. He was active in the Medical Society of New York, the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, many others. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about that, but there's just too many to put on a slide. He was really intent on spreading his support and his energy and being involved socially as well as professionally. He was a Master Mason of the Cain Lodge in New York. He was a 50-year member of the University Club of New York. He was a member of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, where he would even give sermons and addresses. It was remarkable. There's one sermon that he talked about in one of his own biographies he provided for the Phi Beta Pi medical fraternity, and he touted religion and healing as one of his sermons. But then if you looked in his archive, he actually saved the programs of service at the First Avenue Presbyterian Church right up until he died in the 1990s. He delivered that religion and healing sermon actually for the Mary Margaret McBride program on CBS. And so he was speaking outside of just his practice. In 1969, Phi Beta Pi named him Man of the Year, and there were many other county regional working clubs he's a member of, and many, many awards and recognitions he received. But then professionally, he was not just a surgeon. I mentioned his role in physical therapy in the 1940s and 1950s, and that becoming a more well-established academic discipline in different places. He was active there. He was acknowledged as an authority there. He was actually on the council for the American Physiotherapy Association, even before World War II, when he was starting his career as an orthopedic surgeon. And at Cornell, he was one of the first to begin training physical therapists there as a faculty member. Here, this image right here are some of the many, many research drawings from his collection. He was a gifted illustrator and documented a lot of his work along the way. These might have been done by a graphic designer, but he also had illustrations of his work. And you can show the tracking of his research, and this is for some of his research on ankle movement. So he was a professor and instructor of anatomy as well. I mentioned his drawings. His drawings were actually, and examples of his research were frequently published in other journals. He held a position of anatomy, of course, but he also created exhibits and other conference and scholarly proceedings. One of his medical exhibits that got a lot of notice was injuries to the menisci of the knee joint, shown widely across the country. And that received the National Gold Medal Award from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons in 1952. Just a couple of examples related to that exhibit. Again, I could have an entire slideshow of nothing but his awards and plaques as we went forward. But so the gold medal for scientific exhibit. He also received this first award for clinical research in 1952 for some of the same work. I mentioned earlier that he was sought out by some more famous and influential people as a surgeon. So he actually became the surgeon to his boyhood friend, Senator Fulbright. And I have an example of correspondence here from Senator Fulbright, which is maybe showing some patient records, but since the senator mentioned this in the press all the time and described what his buddy Freddie had done for him, I think it's fair to share that out there. But he was also a surgeon to Gloria Vanderbilt. He got written up in the newspapers for being a surgeon to Glenn Davis, who was a very famous football player from West Point. He was also appointed the orthopedic consultant to the entire West Point football program. So people would write him and ask for help, politicians, wealthy, influential people. And in his archives, this correspondence will bleed over sometimes, so to speak, from his personal to his professional, because for him, this is the impression I've gotten, his work with his patients was personal, and he was well known for the personal touch and the care that he showed towards his patients. Again, more than 10,000 patients over 40 years. This article on Glenn Davis has the quote, "Liebolt wielding the scalpel with such skill allowed Glenn to be up and walking 6 days after surgery." And then this note here from Fulbright is actually well after his surgery saying, there's still some stiffness, but it's working. And I just wanted to check back in with you, check with your wife, and just tell you again how thankful I am. So amidst all his professional successes and changes, he also had significant life changes. He was divorced from his first wife, Eugenia, in 1959. He then married Karen Gamble Miles in 1960. He had 2 more children, Karen Lee and Jerry Lee, with his second wife, Karen Gamble, and he also got 2 stepchildren through Karen, Lisa and Chris Gamble. Along the way, as his private practice became much more well-established, and he also sought to marry again that personal and professional life, he moved into a custom-built house called the Imperial House in Manhattan, which he helped design. He then divorced from his second wife in 1969, and his first wife, Eugenia, remarried in 1974. You can see updates from the New York Times here on every time Dr. Liebolt, the famous Dr. Liebolt, remarry, and then what would happen with the Mrs. Liebolt. But he had close relationships with his children over the years, and just a couple of examples of him with his kids. This on the left there is with Karen and Lisa and Chris, and his newly born Karen Lee. And then with Karen Lee, Jerry Lee, and Frederick Lee Jr. Over the years in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s, and into the 1990s when he has his grandchild, who was the daughter of Freddie Lee Jr. So he had a long and successful career, and then he moved into emeritus status and began looking at what his legacy would mean beyond that. He retired from surgical duties at Cornell and at New York Hospital in 1975. So again, he began there in the 1930s, and so he was practicing actively for 40 years and retired officially in 1975. And he was named an honorary member of the New York Hospital staff in 1976. In the 1970s as well, he received maybe one of the most meaningful recognitions that he ever received, which was to be named Distinguished Alumnus from the U of A. And then he was invited back in the 1980s to be the commencement speaker for the College of Arts and Sciences, which he held so near and dear to his heart in 1989. These images here show just one room filled with his awards, plaques, and other examples of his work at the Imperial House, his combination professional offices and home, and then the emeritus professor, Dr. Frederick Lee Liebolt, at his desk. In the 1970s, he was still a traveling scholar, and then he became the distinguished graduate. This image right here is actually from the late 1960s. That's him and his wife, Karen, traveling. He traveled all through Central America to the Middle East. He was often there supporting medical associations and medical fraternities in different nations, and also was an invited speaker. And he attended meetings of his professional colleagues really all over the world. But then, of course, that's Dr. Mullins, who was Chancellor of the University of Arkansas, or President Mullins, presenting that distinguished graduate recognition to Dr. Liebolt in 1973. But he really ensured that his legacy would carry on at his beloved alma mater through endowing a university chair. And this is an article from Northwest Arkansas Times marking the event in 1985 when he endowed a chair and helped establish a pre-med program at his alma mater. And he really believed in paying it forward. So in 85, Liebolt established that endowed chair. And in public statements and in his own reflections, he really expressed this sincere belief he had that medical students could come from a broad background of interest. He liked the idea of students being in another science or even being in the humanities, but then having the support to pursue their medical interests if they wanted. And he really wanted to enhance the undergraduate learning experience in order to allow Arkansas students to do what he did, which is go to maybe a medical school nearby or to use personal connections, but then have no upper limit on what they would do. And he wanted Arkansas students and his endowed chair and support for the establishment of the pre-med, the Liebolt pre-med program, speaks to his belief that Arkansas students should look to the entire nation and the entire world to see where their careers could take them, particularly those who are going to go on to be physicians and surgeons. And so now the Liebolt pre-med program, according to how it describes its health, hosts hundreds of students and has teams of advisors, hundreds of students every year. And this is an example from the dedication page they have for Dr. Liebolt and what the legacy he left for them. So in his final days, Dr. Frederick Lee Liebolt was very active in politics, in patriotic organizations, in genealogical societies. In his last decades, he did phenomenal work collecting his family history, which is really impressive part of his archives. He became a member of the National Republican Party after Fulbright lost re-election. I think there might be a clear connection there, but he did become more involved in politics. He was also a proud member of the Society of Colonial Wars and the Sons of the American Revolution. The image here of Dr. Liebolt in his last years is the portrait for when he became president, actually, of the Sons of the American Revolution. And he passed away in 1996. And this is a quote from his address that he gave at the University Club in New York about his endowed chair. And I won't read the entire thing, but referring to his alma mater, he said that without her and her teachings and her guidelines, I would never have made it. There's something intangible about an education. It's not the books and the going to class. It's not the football and the dances, even though his scrapbooks might have said it was. It is something ethereal, something God-given through your professors, something that rubs off of you and stays put. It gives you direction, purpose, and desire. And these are the things that he received from the University of Arkansas. So thank you for indulging me. And I hope you learned a little bit more about Dr. Frederick Lee Liebolt, a very distinguished and beloved son of Fayetteville and Arkansas.
Thank you, Joshua. I appreciate that. And I'm trying to get you where you're front and center on this. And there we go. I think Dr. Liebolt, I mean, I appreciate your presentation on him because I don't think people don't know a lot about him, but he's probably one of the most influential physicians that have come out of Arkansas.
Yeah, again, I don't know the medical history of Arkansas as nearly as well as I should. I've heard names certainly, and I've looked around and I've done research in some other areas. But it's really amazing, and it's a lot of people don't know about him now, and partly that's him being in New York, but the influence. So I didn't mention this in my talk, but of his 30 publications, they were still cited pretty regularly. If you were to go to any medical literature database, I think you would find citations to Liebolt still. So he was very impactful. And then to have national fame as someone who just grew up right over on what's now Lafayette Street in Arkansas as a surgeon, and someone who didn't know that he was going to be a surgeon and didn't have all the privileges. I mean, he had more privileges than some for sure, coming from where he came from and with the family support. But really a remarkable career.
Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity to meet his son, Frederick III, and visit him in New York when I was at the university. And he had still, and that was probably back in 2010, 2009, something around in there. And he talked so reverently about his father. I mean, it was just amazing how proud he was of the accomplishments of his father.
Yeah. And no slouch, a lawyer himself.
Right.
A very successful person in his own right.
He still lives in, I believe he still lives in the same apartment that they lived in New York on Park Avenue.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it was pretty neat to see him and to meet him and just to hear from him about his father, because, as you know, looking in an archives and reading scrapbooks, you get an impression of a person. But then when you talk to someone who actually knew that person, you sort of get some confirmation of what you were thinking, but then you get these different perspectives on this.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
And I've never really lived with the history of Freddie Liebolt. And so I've studied it. I've helped researchers do it, but it's like you say, I've seen hints here, and I dug in looking for that motivation for someone to be just amazingly driven, and they have the achievement he did. Because speaking for myself, I work hard, but I'm not like that. And so looking for that, but then also seeing that connection with his family and seeing the strong affection he held for his place in history and his place at the University of Arkansas, but also being part of a longer story. He really took that very seriously.
You showed that one picture, and I'll mention this before we sign off, but you showed that one picture near the end of his office, part of one of his offices at Imperial House. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, Imperial House.
And I think those filing cabinets in there were all his patient records.
Yeah.
Some of them. And I think they were still in those filing cabinets when they were brought down to the bay.
Yeah. So a
And
caution to any physicians on the call right now. It's very problematic for the archives, and we want your stuff, but it's problematic to get those records. But it's amazing what he saved. There's a question in the chat about did he stay in touch with Fulbright later in life? And they weren't as frequent in correspondence later in life as they were in the 1950s and 1960s, but he definitely did. In fact, I made that little joke about why he became a Republican. But in the 1960s and 1970s, I know that he was a strong supporter of Fulbright when Fulbright's political career became a little bit more difficult. So there's a lot of correspondence there, and he did stay in touch for sure.
Mm-hmm. And you were right. You know, with the time he graduated, his classmates.
It's amazing.
It's amazing who he graduated with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could talk forever about Charles Monroe Wilson or any one of these people, but then Peggy Sue Lighton, who, you know, isn't nationally known, but if you have lived in Fayetteville for more than a couple of minutes, you've seen the impact of the Lightons around here, and Peggy
Right.
Sue and her, you know, philanthropy and organizational work. It's just that class.
Mm-hmm.
Several years there, really amazing, all the way up through 27 and 28.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so
All
much.
U of A grads are great, of course, but
Yeah, of course. Thank you for that that disclaimer at the end. Well, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. I've wanted someone to talk about Dr. Liebolt ever since we started this series, so I appreciate you doing it. And
thank you so much for having me.
And I just want to I'll remind everyone that this is being recorded, and it will be edited, and then it'll be placed on the YouTube channel, the Society's YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch it, or you can forward it to someone else if you want. So again, Joshua, thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you all for being here, and hopefully we'll tune in next month, July 6th, and we'll be talking about Dr. G. Thomas Jansen, the dermatologist. So everyone be safe. Have a good Friday and a good weekend, and we will see you next month. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.